Hi, you are listening to Chronic and Chill, the podcast about chronic illness and everything else. I'm Jam, the producer, and welcome to this podcast. If I were to ask you, how would you define a disability? What would you tell me? How would you actually define what a disability is? You'll have to pretend that I can actually hear your answers because, it's pre-recorded, but how actually would you define a disability? It's quite difficult when you really think about how you would define it, and you often find that you're leaving out certain things that do come under that category, or that you think come under that category. It is really difficult to define a disability. In my view anyway, I think it's quite hard. Ultimately, a lot of people, their first thought on what a disability is something quite visual. It could be someone in a wheelchair, maybe it's an elderly person, or someone with some kind of mobility aid. I wouldn't blame you for that though, because look at the symbolism and iconography that point to disability. If you go to a disabled toilet, there's someone in a wheelchair that's the symbol of the disabled toilet. Or if you're on public transport in London, you'll see the priority seating area that indicates that people should give up their seat for someone who needs it more than them. It indicates someone who's pregnant, someone in a wheelchair, or some kind of mobility aid like a walking stick. So in society, we have this viewpoint that disabilities are quite visual. And that's not untrue. Many disabilities are visual, but that's not the whole truth. Many of them aren't visible. And I think because of the societal viewpoint that we've created that disabilities are quite visual, it can make it very difficult for those who do not fall in the visual category to identify as such. How people define is up to them, of course. But sometimes I do think that changing that public perception on what a disability is and widening that definition can help people that feel they may not fit in that category but do think that they need some sort of help and struggle to find it because they don't identify as being a person with a disability. I don't know, I think it can help. But I'm not the only person that's been thinking about this. As someone with a chronic illness, it's been quite difficult with that whole definition of what a disability is. So I asked some other people with chronic illnesses what they thought.
Oof, that's a tough one. I think anything physical or mental that hinders you from being able to participate or give 100%, whether it's for work or everyday life, everyday situations that you do. I think that's kind of in a nutshell what I would say. And I do think the mental aspect also plays a big role in it.
I define a disability as anything that prevents you from living a life that's normal to you. Because we all, even without illness, we all have different tolerances.
To me, a disability is something that is negatively affecting your life and your function. How well you function is actually being affected, and therefore it is a bit of a disability for you. Now, I know disability has negative connotations to it. It, in our current society, has become a bit of a derogatory word, like, oh, you have a disability. I find that very unfortunate, only because just because you have disabilities in some areas doesn't make you invalid. You can still function in so many different ways. You just have a little more limits than other people might.
Notice how all their answers were really, really different, and of course they would be, because as humans we all have different perspectives and different ways of seeing the world, so even our definitions on what a disability is and how we view it will be different from each other. Okay, but that's fine, that's people with chronic illnesses and that's how they feel. But let's take it kind of technical, and when I say technical, I mean Google. If I put it into Google, it basically, the first thing that comes up says a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities. Or the other one says a disadvantage or handicap, especially one imposed or recognised by the law. But what about another definition? So in the UK we have something called the Equality Act 2010, and I guess it's in the name, it's all about equal rights. And so it says, you're disabled under the Equality Act 2010 if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. So that's how we define it here, I guess, by law. It's interesting because I found this definition quite recently. I had a discrepancy with a previous company because of my chronic illness/disability, and when looking for legal advice on how I should pursue the issue, they referred me to the Equality Act and asked me, do I consider myself disabled, after they read me that definition. And under that definition, yes, I do think so. I have a physical impairment that has a substantial and long-term effect on my normal day-to-day activities, and unless there's a cure for lupus, I always will do. Interestingly though, with the Equality Act, you are only defined as disabled automatically after diagnosis for certain conditions. So if you have MS, if you have cancer, and I think it's also HIV and AIDS, you are already automatically defined as a disabled person upon diagnosis. And so if you fall outside of that, it doesn't mean that you're not disabled and can't classify as such, but it means that there takes some more digging into your condition and your circumstance to see if you actually come under that definition or not, which is still quite interesting and makes things a little bit tricky, but you know, they have to do what they have to do. So the lovely people that answered the first question, what is a disability, got another nice, really easy question from me as well. Do you consider yourself to have a disability?
I think so, yes. People around me probably not, but yes, I would say so.
I don't know. I don't know if I would call myself disabled, but I do have a disability.
Well, this is an interesting question for me because even though I considered myself a spoonie and a person with chronic illness for so long, I didn't really admit to myself that I was disabled until, I would say, last year.
I was Bridget first, and then the kidney disease came second. And it's only been within the past few years that part of the thing has been the government stuff. I had to stop working, so I had to go on disability, and so now that's how I get my health insurance, and so I kind of have to identify as a disabled person now. But I don't like to think of myself that way. I think it's probably also just a societal negative connotation with that word.
I had a surgery and was hospitalized for about a week in December, where I had an internal infection, and I mean, our immune systems are at 0, so I had really it was just so difficult to fight off. So I had to relearn how to walk, how to drive, how to do all of that. And so my doctor was like, you're considered disabled, so I'm gonna issue you a placard. And I remember being really frustrated when I first heard that, because I was like, no, I don't want to identify as that. But I think that I've come to terms with it more lately.
I think it's a very loaded question. And as I said earlier, it's only been recently that I have started considering myself to be disabled. Not even in so many words, but more oh yeah, I am sick. That's what I know now. And I think I've been trying for years to kind of cover that up and pretend I'm not sick and pretend everything is fine, but yet I can't work or go to school or do very much in a day.
I do. I mean, when you think of the word disability, you think of someone in a wheelchair, you think of, I don't know, you think of the kind of terms that society has put on people with disability, quote unquote. For me, mentally and physically, I do think I have one. So yeah, I absolutely do. And it's, I think, difficult for other people to identify with that. So even saying that out loud, no one's ever asked me that before. So even saying that out loud, I almost feel like I shouldn't say yes because I'm not what society defines as having a disability.
My disability doesn't look like somebody in a wheelchair, somebody with crutches, or, this or that. Or you can't physically look at me and tell that I'm unable to walk 5 more steps. And so what it is I have to remind myself to let me feel like that.
I can tell you for sure that where I live, United Arab Emirates, it's not easy. The doctor didn't know what fibromyalgia was, and that frustrated me. I remember leaving that appointment crying in my car because I had to explain to a doctor what fibro was. And he wasn't interested in listening, and he didn't consider me as a disabled person when I finally told myself I might be disabled.
Some people might be listening to this and think, why does it matter? Why do you need to label yourself? Why? It doesn't matter if you have the label or not. You're just you, and you have a condition, and it is what it is. And that's fine. I think some people can feel that way, and I think I used to feel that way until recently. For me, on a personal level though, I think coming to terms with the term disability itself and seeing where as a human being I fit into that definition has been empowering, because it's made me easier on myself. I was so hard on myself. You should be able to do this, you should be able to do that because you're fine. You're not disabled because there are other people that are worse than you. But that's true, but I'm not fine. And sometimes I need help. Sometimes I need assistance. And being able to come to terms with this definition has made me open to taking that help. And I think someone mentioned this quite well in one of the previous responses that you've just heard. Some people make it seem like it's a really negative thing, and that's part of the problem as well. It's the stigma. There's this stigma of being someone with a disability, like you're lesser, and that's not the case. If you're a person with a disability, you're not less than anybody else. So I guess, it wouldn't be fair to ask a bunch of people if they consider themselves to have a disability or be disabled and not answer that question myself, when the title of this podcast might be, I'm not sure, I haven't decided yet, it might literally be, am I disabled, are you disabled, or something like that. Anyway, yeah. And that's actually the first time, and I'm not even joking, like, you can say that I recorded this like 5 times, but like literally, that's the first time I've actually said that. Like, I am a person with a disability, which is quite strange to say, because even when I knew that I came under that definition and saw myself as such, I felt wrong saying it out loud. I just feel wrong. I feel like I'm an imposter, but that's not the case. And I think it takes some time and some growth to change my viewpoint on that. I think another thing that makes it difficult for people with chronic illnesses, especially those that are invisible, to come to terms with the term disability, is the idea that it's seen as quite binary. Either you are or you aren't. You are disabled or you are not. And I think that can be really, really damaging and problematic to a lot of people that have different kinds of disabilities. I think that there's a lot of diversity in disability. I see disability as a spectrum. Lots of different shades of grey or other colours if you want, I guess. I don't know. I think if we widen up that understanding of what a disability is, I think it can be really helpful to many people.
Well, I think it should be like a spectrum, but the way that we are kind of like told that it's an either black or white thing, because like you said, like when you're filling out forms and stuff, there's very specific black and white questions that it asks, so it makes it hard for people to identify themselves as either being disabled or not. But really, I think it's a massive spectrum.
We sort of get that idea that like disabled people can't do anything at all. Like, if you are just at home, can't do anything, or you are abled and you can do stuff. And then there is most of us who are in that middle ground of, we can do things, but we have certain limitations.
I think there's room, just like everywhere else in life, for areas of grey, for an idea of disability.
Interestingly though, when I was researching this topic to do for this podcast, I came across some interesting concepts. Also, someone messaged me this in my Instagram and I kind of investigated it further. So there are different models of disability. The one that most of us are familiar with is the medical model. It's basically saying that your impairment, the thing that gives you difficulty, is the thing that makes you disabled. Whether that's lupus, Crohn's, arthritis, whether that's because you are in a wheelchair. But one thing I've really grown to love is the social model, which I had never heard of until I researched it. And that basically states that it's not the impairment that is making you disabled, it's the way society is organised. It's the barriers that society has in place that makes you disabled. And we as a society need to think about how we break down those barriers in order for everybody to be able to carry out the things they need to do. I think that concept makes us more aware of each other, and that we should look after each other and think about how we can make a better society for everyone, an accessible society for everyone.
And it's something that I believe sharing our stories as disabled people, to kind of shed new light on what disability is and what it looks like, and expanding that definition. And it doesn't have to be something that holds you back or stops you. It can empower you.
I think doing things like this, podcasts, videos, randomly ranting on social media, sharing our stories about how we navigate through the world is how we can create this change. Talking about it, being open, communicating, sharing our stories as people with chronic illnesses, mental health conditions, and other disabilities. Sharing our stories is how I think we'll create this change. Thank you so much for listening to that episode of Chronic and Chill. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something as well. Huge thank you to the wonderful people who allowed me to interview them. As you can hear, a lot of the interviews were over the phone because People with chronic illnesses live in all parts of the planet. So once again, big thank you to my contributors, my guests to this podcast. You can follow them underneath, so I will link all their social media and information below. And I guess some food for thought for you, the listener. What do you think a disability is? Comment below. And do you think disability is like a spectrum? Do you think that there's some diversity in that definition? Or do you think it's very cut and dry? Is it yes or no? You're disabled or you aren't? Do you completely disagree with what was said by me and some other people? Chronic and Chill is an open discussion, so please let me know in the description below. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully you check out my next episode next time. I'm not going to put a timestamp on it. You're just going to see it. It's just going to come up at some point. And yeah, I'm done talking now. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you guys later.